This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. The topic today, intermittent fasting. I'm trying this myself right now based on this episode. My guest today, Mark Mattson, is a pro in this territory. He understands all the good, the bad, the ugly. What is intermittent fasting? Essentially, in a 24-hour window, you try to keep your meals inside of 6 hours. That means not eating for 18 hours. There are all kinds of proven benefits to this. And going back to the beginning, evolutionarily, we were not designed to sit around and eat all freaking day. It's not the way to go. I actually was having a conversation with Larry Height today. Larry is the thinnest he's been, and for this exact thing, the fasting. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my guest today, Mark Mattson, and get into the nitty-gritty, get into the details, and see if you can find a lifestyle change based on this episode. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Mark Mattson. It's an interesting time to have the opportunity to pick your mind in the sense of where your career, your research, and everything has gone, especially considering the last 2 years, especially considering that we all know now that carrying extra weight, we're going to talk about this today, but it's always been not great for us, but it's been doubly bad during the last 2 years. Can I ask you, just big picture, how did you, given your career, given your research, given to how you understand us and food and eating, what have you been thinking about the last 2 years? How has this affected your thought process?
I was trained in zoology and neuroscience. We always put things in an evolutionary perspective. It's important. Our genes and the proteins they encode and all the cells in our body and brain evolved in non-human primate ancestors and then going further down the evolutionary tree. The cells in our genes evolved to function well in environments where food was scarce, environmental conditions were harsh. Typically, you don't find obese animals in the wild, including our hunter-gatherer ancestors before the agricultural revolution. That's one thing I've pondered a lot, trying to put our work in animal models and then human clinical trials in perspective from that regard. One thing we found, general thing, is that overeating makes our cells complacent. Our cells and organ systems are not challenged with the kind of mild things of going without food for extended time periods, having to expend considerable physical effort in the food-deprived state. So what happens is the cells become unable to respond to stresses and aging and are more prone to disease in people who are relatively sedentary and overindulgent.
The direction that your career goes, your research, it's matter of fact. I don't walk away from your work, your most recent book. I don't walk away and say to myself and have some feeling of emotion. I just walk away and I say, well, that's a really interesting deep dive that this man has made. And it seems like that if we could move or nudge humanity in this direction, we'd be much better off. There must be a certain sense of frustration to know what you know and then see the last 2 years unfold and realize that we could have been in a much better place if people understood some of your work.
Well, yeah, that's for sure. The major risk factors for poor outcomes with COVID are obesity, diabetes, asthma, for example. All of these risk factors, and age, which is the major risk factor, all of these risk factors are exacerbated by overeating, not getting enough exercise. And as far as the brain goes, a third lifestyle factor is being engaged in intellectual activities throughout your adult life, like you and I are doing now, Mike. I point that out because most of our work has been on the brain. And also, it turns out that people who recover from COVID, it's looking like some of them, particularly those with risk factors for poor outcomes, may be prone to some cognitive problems down the road. It's early days in looking at those kinds of data, but a colleague of mine at the NIH, who studies the effects of infectious agents on the brain, is obtaining some evidence for that. And he did a lot of work on HIV, which it turns out the drugs that are used to treat HIV, which is another virus not so dissimilar to COVID, he found that, well, not just him, a lot of investigators found that the drugs used to treat HIV/AIDS are effective in enabling the person to live longer. But many of these people, when they get into their even 50s, they're developing cognitive impairment. Their brains are having age-related problems, seem to be accelerated.
Is that from the drugs or from the HIV itself?
It's from the HIV itself. The drugs don't cross what's called the blood-brain barrier. They don't get into the brain, and there's evidence that there's a reservoir of the virus in the brain, probably in stem cells or another type of cell called a glial cell, but not in neurons. And that actually we helped him in some studies where we showed that two proteins that are produced by the virus, the HIV virus, can damage neurons and make them more vulnerable to conditions we think are occurring in Alzheimer's disease.
Before we dive into some more specifics of your work, one more broad question, or just to see what observation you might want to share. And this is not meant to be a controversial question, a political question, anything like that. But it seems like the dialogue, the public dialogue in the last 2 years, which I understand panic and I understand fear, it seems like it should have been an opportunity to educate and an opportunity to share insights, especially from those that are really knowledgeable. And of course, I understand different scientists might have different views and different opinions and all that kind of fun stuff. But do you look at the last 2 years as perhaps a lost opportunity to where instead of having this great conversation, a terrible time for many people, but this opportunity for a great conversation, but it seems like we didn't have that conversation, specifically getting into the preventative, the science behind all this, just a guy like you being more at the forefront. It seems like we missed out on something like that. Am I barking up the wrong tree?
No, you're not. Wearing masks and getting vaccinated should be no-brainers for anyone, and that there shouldn't be any controversy about that. But you're right. What hasn't been in the public conversation at all on any of the major media is the fact that the risk factors for poor outcomes are risk factors for other major diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancers, diabetes. People have the opportunity, in general, the whole population, to take that seriously and reduce the chances that they're going to have poor outcomes if they do get infected. It's unfortunate. Hopefully down the road in the coming years, there will be more effort on this. Now, there's multiple factors that work against making that information major conversation. One is, and this is a general problem, that people are bombarded with advertisements for drugs to treat their diabetes, to treat their cardiovascular disease, etc. They're bombarded with advertisements for unhealthy food. They get in their car. Nowadays, and this is one thing with COVID, right? A lot of people are working from home. just with advances in technology, many people are just sitting all day long, don't have the opportunity or environment that would kind of motivate them or stimulate them to have more healthy lifestyles.
It's all so directly related to lifespan. So here I am, I'm a Gen X guy, early 50s. I look at your work and I'm like, okay, I've not been doing the intermittent fasting. We're going to talk about that today. But, I look at your work and it's like, okay, this is a no-brainer. I keep myself in shape. I love exercising, all that kind of fun stuff. I might be carrying an extra 5 to 10 pounds, but I'm shocked that so many people you're not the only reservoir of this information. You're not the only person that's going down this path. I'm shocked at how many people can just tune out and allow their physical bodies to move so far away from that early evolutionary period, that foraging period of mankind, to allow themselves to move so far away when they've got to know somewhere in there, even if they don't have your background, they've got to know that the lifespan stuff and the quality of life is just dropping when carrying so much extra weight.
It has a lot to do with one's perception of time and putting off till tomorrow and next year. What you could start today, because you're feeling okay generally today. There's no obvious immediate negative consequences that you perceive, although insidiously things are happening that are not so good in your cells and organ systems. So I think that has a lot to do with it. Another factor is that anyone who exercises regularly knows this, that they feel good when they exercise, particularly after they exercise. And there's a lot of physiological things that are going on, but also psychological things. They feel better about themselves. And then if they're in a situation, for example, have an injury or something else that they have to stop exercising, they don't feel good when they stop. That's true also with intermittent fasting, maybe not as dramatically as can occur in a lot of people with exercise. So this getting into an exercise routine as part of your daily routine, changing your eating pattern. We've done studies looking at the brains of animals, and we and others have evidence this is true in humans. It takes several weeks to a month for your cells, body, brain to adapt to a new eating pattern or an exercise routine, so that the initial, if you will, side effects, if you've been sedentary and you go and try to run 5 miles, you're not going to feel good. You're not going to be able to do it first place. You get discouraged. However, if you can ease yourself into it over time and stick with it for, say, a month, which seems to be like a magic time period, then you'll be adapted. You'll feel good. In case of exercise, you're likely to continue. With intermittent fasting, there are data. We need more data, but it looks like for perhaps a majority of people who switch their eating pattern and stick with it for a few months at least, then they can make it part of their lifestyle and go long term. And then finally, the last thing I want to say on this is that the early life family environment is a critical factor. Here in the United States, for example, it's very clear that there's a transgenerational obesity, diabetes problem that's on a regional basis. The southern states, the incidence of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease is much higher than in northern states. So kids grow up with parents who have poor lifestyle habits with regards to health. They tend to follow what their parents do. Not always, but it's often the case. We now have a situation where kids even having obesity, type 2 diabetes, when they're, say, middle school, high school age even. So this is something that's a big problem.
Let me let you establish, because we haven't done it yet, definitionally, intermittent fasting. A lot of people have heard about it. When you're first explaining, this could be friends, family, a group of students, What's your opening salvo for how you bring in, of course, this gets deep, got the book in front of me, but what is your opening salvo for trying to bring people into, and we'll break this apart, but bringing them into the idea of intermittent fasting?
Well, one of the simplest ways to describe it is that there are two main stores of energy in your body. One is in the liver, and that's glucose or sugar. And the other is in your fat cells. Fat's a source of energy. The liver glucose is always utilized first when you stop eating. That energy, the glucose in the liver, will last about 10 to 12 hours. If you exercise during that time period, the liver glucose will be depleted a little more quickly. Then what happens when the liver energy is gone, fats are released from fat cells into your blood, and they're broken down into what are called ketones, which are a really good fuel for cells. Fasting is when the switch from glucose to ketones occurs. So when your ketones start going up, cells start utilizing the ketones. And in fact, studies have shown in humans that during extended fast, the brain cells use almost entirely the ketones as an energy source. So that's the definition. If you eat breakfast, lunch, dinner, and evening snack, you're likely not fasting long enough to cause this metabolic switch. So typically anything beyond 12 hours, but by 14, 16 hours, you're clearly into the ketogenic state. And that seems to be important for many of the health benefits. One way that many people incorporate intermittent fasting eating pattern into their lifestyle is simply to compress the time window that they eat each day into 6 to 8 hours, for example.
A simple way to hack your way through as someone's listening to this conversation, it could be something like eating from 12 p.m. to 6 p.m. and not eating outside of that window.
Yeah, that's right. Then you'll be fasting for 18 hours. And that's, in fact, the routine I use. Personally, I didn't adopt that eating pattern because I knew anything about intermittent fasting. It was way back in the 1970s when I was in graduate school at the University of Iowa. And it's kind of stressful being in graduate school. And I lived about 7 miles from the campus, and I rode my bike in, and I started to have a lot of problems with gastric reflux and chest pain associated with that. And part of the reason was I'd get up in the morning and I'd eat whatever, cereal, orange juice, and I'd get on the bike and ride 7 miles. And it's not good to exercise right after you've eaten. So anyway, I found if I skipped breakfast, it had like a dramatic beneficial effects on the reflux. And so I just quit eating breakfast. It wasn't until the 1990s that my lab started to do research on intermittent fasting.
You stumbled into the hack before you even thought about what was going on. And by the way, you said, this is, I think, an interesting point for the audience. You said this earlier, but you just said it again, which is an eating pattern. You didn't say diet.
Yes. Diet is what you eat and how much you eat. Intermittent fasting, it's not a diet. It's an eating pattern, independent of what is eaten and how much. Now, having said that, I'm not saying that your health is going to be fine if you eat junk food and do intermittent fasting, because the junk food still has an adverse effect on you. There may be some benefit, and probably is, of the intermittent fasting, but it's not going to completely counteract an unhealthy diet that has a lot of refined sugar and saturated fat.
A few minutes ago, you were describing the benefits, and you said the phrase seems to be important, which sounded like a hedge. I think you believe it's beyond seems to be important. I think it is important.
The seems to be important had to do with the effects of intermittent fasting on the cells.
The science is not in yet completely, or where are you at on that?
The science is in that this metabolic switching is beneficial for health, makes our cells more resilient, resistant to disease. The extent to which the ketones themselves explain these beneficial effects is unclear. That is to say, all the health benefits of an intermittent fasting eating pattern may not be accounted for simply by ketones. So, for example, if we were to extrapolate that to an extreme, if the health benefits were completely due to the ketones, then, for example, taking a ketone ester would result in all the health benefits of intermittent fasting itself. In our animal studies, we find that isn't the case, that there's more going on than just ketones going up with intermittent fasting. And so that was my point.
Let me let you go back in time and lay down some evolutionary history for us Homo sapiens. And if you want to add some dates to the best of how we know, that'd be great. Kind of describe our ancestors, the foraging, the not having the guarantee of 3 square meals per day. This was how we got to where we are. This is why we became so successful. And it's really only in modern times that we're kind of bastardizing all that evolutionary gain. Can you lay out the case going back in time and just kind of give people a brief history of how we once did live?
I'll go backwards from now. About 10,000 years ago, approximately, in countries in the Middle East, around the Nile River Delta, for example, humans were able to domesticate some meat animals, sheep, cattle, for example. They were also able to domesticate grain, wheat in Asia, rice, barley, and so on. Agriculture started. With that, what happened was that it became possible to have food available most of the time. Of course, there were bad years with droughts and so on, but for the most part, food was able to be stored and available all the time. Before then, humans were hunter-gatherers. They spent a lot of their time searching for food, processing the food, if you will. For example, breaking open nuts and taking out the meat. And typically, the hunter-gatherer societies of modern days, the men do the hunting and the women do the foraging. So their eating patterns were sporadic, depending on whether they're able to find and kill a prey animal or not. Now, if you think about what we know from the archaeological record regarding the cleverness of humans, their ability to invent tools, for example, all of the early tools that we're aware of that were invented by humans were tools that functioned in the acquisition or processing of food. So initially, flake stones, and then spearheads, and then bow and arrow, and then at some point guns. And then when they transitioned to agriculture, initially, a lot of the inventions, even complicated things, initially using horses and cattle to pull plows and that kind of stuff, and then eventually the gasoline engine and tractors. The point there is that our brains evolved under an evolutionary pressure to enable success in acquiring food. Nowadays, very few people, certainly in industrialized countries, have to worry too much about having food available and where they're going to get it. Our brains are being repurposed. We're able to develop specific skills, but our brains' generalist ability, we think, is going down. In fact, there's evidence from measuring skull size that the brains of modern day humans are smaller by about 10% than the brains of hunter-gatherers before the agricultural revolution.
It's interesting how fast that can happen.
Yes. Now, another point here is that there are many animals that evolved in a way that it was to their advantage of the individual animal to cooperate with its friends or close relatives and work together to kill a prey animal. So, for example, wolves in the wild they hunt in packs. By cooperating, they're able to corner and kill a large prey animal that an individual couldn't kill by themselves. The social brain, the ability to cooperate and work together towards a common goal, which in animals in the wild is mainly getting food. One could even make the case that our large social networks today, originally, those neural circuits in the brain that facilitated cooperation actually evolved for cooperation and being able to obtain food in environments where food was scarce.
Let me shift to something that happened to me today and let you analyze it, give some perspective. So this afternoon, I was training with a trainer here in Saigon, Vietnam. That's where I am today. For those that don't know, I've mentioned on the podcast before, but from the World Health Organization's stats, at least how they've gone about measuring obesity, Vietnam is the least obese country in the world. My home country, excluding a few small South Pacific islands, America's the most obese country. It's a terribly interesting thing to be around thin people. Some Asian countries, you're starting to see obesity tick up down towards Indonesia and whatnot. But I think what's interesting about Asia, and my trainer today, I told her I was going to be speaking with you and what the conversation was going to be like. And she immediately wanted some perspective on rice. Of course, I'm in Vietnam. Everyone eats rice in China, Japan, everywhere. My first thought was, well, okay, it's a carbohydrate. It's almost like an Asian version of bread to some degree, but there's not an obesity problem in a place like Vietnam. Rice is enjoyed, rice is utilized. It's not crossing the line, perhaps, to how we see cereals and breads and everything in America get consumed. I'm curious your perspective about something like rice in Asia. It's such a staple. So many Asian countries, you do not have an obesity problem, even though rice is such a staple. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. In those countries, they don't eat excessive amounts of rice. My opinion on grains, particularly whole grains, is they're fine. They can be a good part of a diet as long as you don't eat excessively. Now, what they don't have much of in the Asian countries, or at least didn't until the Americans starting to
imported McDonald's everywhere.
First, they imported cigarettes, kind of the same thing. Of course, I traveled a lot over the last 4 decades as a scientist, and I'd go to Asia or even Europe. It was very striking. You get off the plane, even in Europe, obesity is increasing in Europe, or at least in some of the countries. 30 years ago, there was a striking difference between the United States and most European countries, a lot more obesity in the United States. And I've had colleagues and students from Asia, and there is somewhat of an increase in obesity, for example, in Japan, South Korea. But the point is that in Vietnam, they don't eat a lot of processed foods, although I'm sure there are McDonald's in Saigon now.
There's 3. A couple of them have closed. Vietnamese generally don't like burgers. I've not figured out why. I like burgers, but they're not big burger fans.
So the processed food industry, essentially they have chemists whose job is to develop, if you will, formulations that are very palatable and addictive. Salt is another common thing that eat potato chips that are salted. You tend to eat a lot more than you would if they weren't salted. There's a couple things. Small portions in Vietnam, mostly unprocessed food. It's a transgenerational thing where the kids for probably millennia have grown up in families where the portions at meals are small.
It's fun to have this chat with you because for me, it's such a contrast. You just mentioned how much travel you've had the chance to in your career. It's hard to share this experience. I'm sure it's been a positive effect on me, even if I didn't make a conscious choice, maybe osmosis, to be around people that are just eating smaller portions. I'm sure I eat smaller portions now. I'm not racing out to get the 24-inch hoagie anymore, It's nothing like that's happening in my life anymore.
That's true. Mike, this is a really good point. There are many people who aren't able to travel much. usually just because of their economic situation. And
It changes you.
exactly, that's what I'm saying. If more people in the United States traveled and were able to see how people live and how their health is better in some of these other countries, something might click in their brains.
This might sound funny to some of the audience, but if we go back and we were to analyze hunter-gatherer periods and whatnot, okay, there's always an attraction between men and women. For me, I come to Saigon and I happen to be single at that point in my life and don't know exactly what's going on inside. You probably have a lot better idea than me. I don't know exactly what's going on inside my mind, but just show up around 2013. I'm like, wow, hold on. The ladies here seem to be thinner than my home country. And this is triggering something inside my cranium that says this is positive. Mike likes this. I'm not trying to be crass or anything, but I think sometimes we've gotten to the point, sometimes we don't have honest conversations about how interrelated and interconnected all these issues are.
Well, it's definitely true. Since we don't want to stereotype, and certainly there's a lot of variability, but in general, since women in Asian countries tend to be more slim, and what we, through cultural or perhaps even evolutionary reasons based on evolution, we perceive the women who are not overweight as more sexually attractive. That's just a reality.
And you say that just as a matter of fact thing, there's nothing behind it. Of course, it's become controversial to talk about these topics. I just think it's useful. And of course, look, the ladies in America can turn around and say, well, hold on, all you guys in America are all overweight. Fair enough, fair point. It's an equal opportunity employer, this weight issue. I want to shift you into aging. This ties in with what we've been talking about so far, and I don't think most people probably think about it, which is this very topic of intermittent fasting also has not only the potential benefits of, okay, let's reduce our heart risk exposure, our diabetes exposure, let's just feel better, but it also has the opportunity to increase the lifespan of us. That's fascinating.
Our first experiments with intermittent fasting was in rats and in experimental models that are relevant to Alzheimer's and actually Huntington's disease. And then we did some Parkinson's disease models. So these are animals, for example, in the Alzheimer's disease model, these animals get amyloid accumulation in their brain. They get dysfunction and degeneration of neurons and learning and memory problems in an age-dependent manner. Because advancing age is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, this was back in the 1990s, we simply asked if we put these animals on an intermittent fasting eating pattern that others had shown extends lifespan by up to 50% in rats and mice, will the intermittent fasting counteract age-related pathology in the brain and consequent functional deficits? And we found it did. So I mentioned that others had shown that if you take rats, and this is beginning when they're young, but also there's a beneficial effect starting later in life. But if you start when they're young on intermittent fasting, they can live up to 50% longer. And then in humans, although we can't look at lifespan very easily in humans, you'd have to follow people throughout their life on intermittent fasting or not. What we do have is what are called biomarkers of aging and age-related diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancers, diabetes. And we find in humans, and by we, I mean, now there's been hundreds, actually several hundred studies in humans of intermittent fasting, some of them looking at biomarkers. It's found that the intermittent fasting shifts the biomarkers in a direction that suggests reduced risk for heart disease, cancer, stroke, and type 2 diabetes.
For all of us, whether we've had some exposure, and I've been exposed to the concept for a while, I've just not executed. Once one starts to understand that this research, this understanding exists, it's a choice. And the question I want to pose to you, Now that we can see this choice, and this is a little bit of a theoretical question, how can you imagine the future of the brain in the sense that there is going to be a certain part of our population, global population, that will wake up to these insights and perhaps they will execute. And then there's going to be a certain part of the population that doesn't. You can just imagine, I mean, this is evolution at work, I guess, to some degree. You don't know how it will unfold exactly. I can see that, or I can guess that there can be different branches of human in the future. Could there not? This is a really distant future. Hopefully the Earth will still be here. It sure seems like these choices that we're making, these very different choices among some populations, there's a long-term effect of this.
Just based on evolutionary history of other species and us, there are multiple species that preceded humans that went extinct, and Neanderthals is the classic example. The question of whether there'll be a divergence, a splitting of humans based on their lifestyle and diet is unclear. I would go back, though, to what I said earlier about in the southern states, and this will be a little bit controversial, but I point this out in my book. There is a correlation with educational attainment. So, for example, in the southern states where childhood obesity and parental obesity is much more prevalent, there are fewer high school graduates and fewer kids go on to college. Now, many people who study this, sociologists, and focus on socioeconomic status and poor schools, based on data, including studies in humans showing that on average, even in children, adolescents with obesity, their brains, and particularly certain brain regions that are important for learning and memory, are smaller than in other kids. And that's based on MRI imaging of the brains. I point out it's not every kid with obesity, but if you do the statistics, it's clear reproducible effect. So I would suggest if somehow these families can get into a healthier diet and lifestyle, not only will it improve their general health and reduce their disease risk, but it may actually help their kids do better in school.
This gets us back to the beginning of my conversation and kind of the opening salvo of a question, which is we had this unique time period in the last 2 years to have a lot of these discussions. And of course, I understand there was a lot of fear. Nobody wants to die from a strange virus that suddenly appears. But we definitely knew early on that the risk factors beyond age and were heavily skewed towards obesity. I felt like there was a conscious decision, this is me speaking, a conscious decision by leaders to not talk about that issue. I don't care whether it's the left or the right. I don't recall any leader saying, hey, this is a unique opportunity to really reassess how we are living with food. Am I crazy?
I don't know if there was a conscious effort. One aspect of this was that, particularly in the United States, but other countries, there was some panic among the government officials and urgency to mitigate the problem. So the effort was put into vaccine development. There's this lack of thinking that public messaging could actually help some people. With intermittent fasting and exercise, people with type 2 diabetes and with obesity can, over a period of months, have quite dramatic improvements in their health indicators and risk factors for outcomes with COVID. I think it's unfortunate.
That was my point, in the sense that I wasn't trying to say that to stop vaccine development or anything like that. I was just saying it seemed like there could have been a parallel opportunity to kick people in the butt a little bit.
And certainly there would be a good number, I couldn't estimate the percentage, good number of people that would listen and say, oh, hey, I'm in my 50s, 60s, have obesity. If I get this virus, I may have poor outcome. I have the opportunity to do something now within a few months or so, reduce my risk a little bit. There are others, of course, who would just ignore the public messaging, which seems to unfortunately happen a lot in this country.
From your perch, from your research direction, from your understanding, it's got to be somewhat frustrating sometimes to know that there are concrete ways that are available to everyone, and we can't get everyone going that direction.
I'd like to point out that I'm optimistic the intermittent fasting situation, it's become quite popular, right? There's tons of stuff on the internet, most of it just saying this is how you do it. Isn't so much on the science.
You do the deep dive for sure.
Yeah, it covers everything from evolutionary perspective, historical perspective, aging, specific diseases, what's going on in the cells. The thing is, the medical community, mainstream medicine, is interested in intermittent fasting. And this happened over the last 5 years. I wrote a review article with a colleague for the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a medical journal in this country, a review article on intermittent fasting. I've actually looked, there's more than 100 clinical trials ongoing in the United States of intermittent fasting in patients with various disorders. A lot of work in cancer now, but many other diseases. Is interest in medical education. For example, at Johns Hopkins, of course, that's where I'm at, but I've given lectures. Every year I give an hour-and-a-half lecture to the medical students on intermittent fasting. I'm not so discouraged. I'm actually less discouraged now than I was, say, 5 years ago, when most doctors never heard of intermittent fasting, couldn't advise patients on it. Now, increasing number of physicians are aware, they're reading a little bit about the science, and they're telling patients, hey, this is something you should seriously consider in addition to exercise.
You've swayed me. I'm going in. I'm doing the Mike experiment. I'm going to go in and I'm going to get past that initial 1 month finish line to feel the change. But you've inspired me. I'm all in. I'm going to give it a shot.
Shoot me an email a few months from now.
I've done a lot of body changes in the last couple of years and are very good with the exercise. But this is one of the things, when you dive into your work, it's one of these things I can feel myself, the desire for certain sugary this or that at certain points in time. You just realize I'm exactly in the middle of what I need to be not in the middle of. The only part for me that I don't enjoy thinking about is if I do go the path of, let's say, eating between 12 and 6, is missing out on like egg breakfast or something, that early morning desire to eat something.
The magic month should take care of that. I would expect that a month from now, if you skip eating breakfast for a month, you'll no longer be hungry in the morning, and you're going to find alertness and mental clarity is really good in the morning. Animals in the wild don't wake up and have breakfast available, and they have to be alert and their brain all geared up to figure out how to get food.
That's like the easiest hack. I mean, even without people diving in deep, it's such an easy hack to just say, skip breakfast and don't eat past 6 p.m.
Once you get into it, it can become routine and it's no big deal. You can still eat lunch and dinner with friends and work colleagues and so on.
Cool stuff, Mark. People need to check out the book, The Intermittent Fasting Revolution, The Science of Optimizing Health and Enhancing Performance. Cool stuff. Great job. People can check you out. You're easily found out there in the wild, so to speak. Johns Hopkins. Very cool stuff. Is there any place you would like to send people? They can buy the book on Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. Would you like to direct people to any particular website?
I'm starting a podcast myself. The initial ones aren't as good as yours probably, but hopefully they'll improve. But it's called Brain Ponderings, and it's going to be on brain science, all sorts of things from brain evolution, brain development, diseases, how we learn and remember things, how to improve that. That's about the only thing. I haven't been on social media or anything, on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter, Facebook. I'll put my podcast on Spotify. Beyond that, the best source for things having to do with medicine and biomedical science is PubMed. And of course, a key thing for a general audience is if you type in something, say you're looking for Alzheimer's disease, be kind of put in Alzheimer's disease, the word review, which will give you a review article. You can kind of refine it from there. There's a lot of information on the internet that may not be really accurate or scientifically established. And so as a scientist, I kind of tend to avoid things that people are giving opinions that those people aren't experts on what they're talking about.
I know you've done a deep dive in your career. I hope I kept you engaged enough on this conversation. It can be somewhat daunting when I'm not an expert in the field to jump in and try to do a little hand-to-hand combat for an hour. So I hope I kept you going.
I'm finding, just was doing 2 podcasts, that it's daunting for me to do the opposite, to try to make things more easily understandable to non-scientists. So that's probably an equally difficult task for scientists, is to explain things in a way that the average person understands, and to, at the same time, educate them and have them learn some new things, maybe some new terms, new perspectives on various things.
Well, I think we did an okay job at that today.
Yeah, I think so.
I appreciate you coming on, and please keep me posted about future books that will surely come down the pike. I really appreciate you coming on.
Okay, Mike.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.